Hey, what's up, guys? Hope you had a amazing 4th of July weekend. We definitely did. I came down from New York and went to see Sagar's new place. That was really fun, and hope you guys did likewise. But we've, of course, have an amazing show for you, too. We brought George Packer of The Atlantic on the show today, and we have so much to talk about.
Really enjoy talking with George. He's always somebody who's gotten it. Read his book, 2013, The Unwinding. This is kind of a follow-up to that. What's wrong with America? Who actually lives here? There are 4 different ones in his telling, and a 5th one called Equal America, which is the way that we get out. Before your spider senses get off, I think that you will be confounded no matter what your political feelings are, and I think you're all really going to enjoy this. You can purchase George's book with a link to our bookshop, which is down in the show notes, but let's get to it.
George Packer, welcome to the Realignment.
So good to be with you both.
Good to see you, George.
Nice to meet you.
Let's start with an obvious question. We were listening to the episode you did with the American Conservative. You spoke with Helen Andrews, who's also come on the podcast. And you said this book is a book for folks who feel politically homeless. And this is something Sagar and I talk about all the time. We've been hearing that phrase more and more and more. And we used to be really hostile towards it just because we're from DC. So instantly our DC hat came on and we're thinking, okay, is this weird Ralph Nader stuff? Is this third party, no labels, astroturfing? I just couldn't really take it seriously, but we just keep hearing it come up more and more times from serious people like yourselves. So before we get into the book and the 4 different Americas, I would just love to hear you expand on what your definition of politically homeless is and why you think this book is set to appeal to people who are frankly in this audience.
I mean, look, I'm a member of the Democratic Party. I imagine I always will be. So in a sense, I have a political home, but I feel ill at ease with a lot that's going on in the Democratic Party and more broadly on the left, which is where I get most of the flack that does come. On the other hand, the right is moving into a direction that seems like a terrible dream. It seems like a form of nihilism at times. And the media, it has so many incentives to push even further in both directions toward what seemed to me just irrational, but absolutely certain and fixed positions, so that the possibility of even beginning a conversation is kind of taken away, because you have to have some fundamental agreement about what are the issues, what are the facts. We're going to disagree about them, but at least we can talk. So it's easy to blame the media, but I do blame the media. I think the media produces a lot of conflict that is totally out of touch with the way most Americans feel, and the way they vote. For example, the voting patterns of the last election totally exploded a lot of media narratives about what white men are like, what Black men and Black women are like, what immigrants are like. So I was deeply satisfied. Even though I despised and deplored Trump, I was deeply satisfied that his share of the Latino vote went up, his share of the Black vote went up, his share of the immigrant vote went up, just because it was a kind of finger in the eye to the certainties and the monoliths. So I think homelessness is a reaction to that. It doesn't mean you don't stand for anything or believe in anything. It just means stop encasing me in a concrete straitjacket. I can't live in this.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I've basically, my entire success is owed to that literal message, both Crystal and I think that's basically, if you were to sum it up, that's the thesis on which we built our show and on which this show is built as well, in terms of exploring, like, look, red, blue is not a particularly useful definition of American politics today. And one of the things I love most about your book is about putting putting political identities into 4 different yet distinct buckets, which we might be able to understand the intra-coalitional fights and rules and power more that explain politics today. So I know you've had to do this a million times, but give our audience who may not have heard, the New York Times book review or whatever, of what the 4 Americas are, in your view, and then what the 5th one, which you advocate for, could and probably should look like.
I'm absolutely happy to do it. And each time I do it, I have more critical thoughts about my own taxonomy. Um, the four have a kind of chronological order because they have taken turns dominating our political discourse. This is not like what the Unwinding attempted to be, which was more like an ethnography or a map of Americans in different parts of the country, in different walks of life. This is not a portrait of the country. It's a description of, as you say, ideas about what the country is, what it should be. The first is free America. That's the America of low taxes, deregulation, the invisible hand of the market. It's Ronald Reagan's America. For most of my adult life, it's been the dominant one. It has set the terms of our politics, of governing, of our language, our political language. I think it was attractive in the early years of Reagan, partly because of Reagan himself, his rhetorical power, and partly because the 70s was such a drag. I mean, I lived in the 70s. Yeah, you guys weren't alive. Come on.
Right.
I was
We've
there.
watched movies. We've seen movies.
Yeah, like, I watched
great.
Taxi Driver once, George, just for your information.
Well, to me, it was like, I just remember things not working very well and things being kind of ugly and really wanting to either be in the future or the past, but certainly not where I was. Of course, I was a teenager, which that's almost a description of what teenage life is about. And suddenly you have this roaring economy and you have all this economic enterprise and entrepreneurship. And it looked like, Reagan had unlocked the secret of American energy, except it turned out free America really did send most of the benefits to the top and to corporations, to monopoly corporations, because of changes in the way antitrust law was enforced, and destroyed a lot of the basis for blue collar America, for not just labor unions, but communities that had depended on blue collar jobs. I mean, this was obviously globalization at work and technological change, but free America really had no answer for globalization and technological change, except just keep cutting taxes and eventually prosperity will become general. And after 20, 25 years, it became clear that no, it's not happening in a lot of the country. And economic inequality has been the fundamental social fact of my adult life. Obviously, that goes way beyond what goes on in Washington, but I think Washington has had almost no answer for economic inequality. Yes. Smart America, that's really the world I live in and grew up in. It's the educated professionals America. It's the meritocracy. It's credentialism. If you go to the right schools, get the right degree, enter the right profession, the future is yours. And then you make sure that your children do the same thing. And in fact, the family business is success. And it's a really onerous, taxing business. And children bear a tremendous amount of weight as they go through all the anxieties of extracurricular activities and college application essays. And simply getting into the right college is the main event in the life cycle of a smart American family. The problem with meritocracy, besides all the kind of psychological cost it imposes, is that it actually has become a kind of aristocracy, in my view. It's a world into which you are more likely born than into which you enter on the basis of your talents and efforts. So the promise of meritocracy, which is that merit should be rewarded, which is an undeniable truth, is betrayed by the reality, which is that basically certain families, certain communities have the inside track, have the connections, have the means, and even have the values. I mean, it's not as though they're just a bunch of grifters. They have the values, but to make sure that this is transmitted to the next generation. So that's sort of Bill Clinton's America, I think, and it shared some of the values or some of the ideas of free America in that it's open to globalization. It's somewhat skeptical of too much government intervention, and it's free trade, open, immigration, a kind of tolerant view of the world. of America's interconnectedness with the world. Real America, which is a phrase Sarah Palin used in 2008, is a reaction against the failures of free and smart America. And to me, there's like a straight line. I emphasize Palin. I think of her as like a John the Baptist figure. She was the forerunner of Trump. And you can draw a straight line from Palin to Trump. Trump took sort of her instincts, which were hostile to the educated class, hostile to the coast, to the elites, to the cities, to immigrants, and her emphasis on a certain kind of American as real, white, Christian, heartland, working with their hands, small town, rural areas. That's how she described real America in the speech she gave. Trump used that narrative to tell a lot of people what they already believed. We were saying earlier that he was the first person to get elected by saying things really suck in this country.
Yes,
we're a lot worse than you think. And the optimistic, sunny version of Reagan or Bill Clinton simply didn't speak to a lot of people by 2016. And Trump was speaking a different language, which was the language of real America. And it's been, I think, in conflict with free America for the soul of the Republican Party. You could say that the elites of the party are still following the cargo cult of low taxes and deregulation as the solution to all social problems. But the more interesting figures in the party, I think, are talking more the talk of real America, which is populist. And then finally, Just America is also a rebellion. It's a rebellion by children against their parents. It's a rebellion by the meritocrats' children against the meritocratic parents, and a kind of refusal to accept that things are getting better, a refusal of progress, a refusal of the optimistic American story. Instead, it's a kind of a picture of a caste society where identity groups are in a hierarchy, with some in the role of oppressor and some in oppressed, which has always been true and is true today and probably will always be true. And it's the role of activists to hammer on it and to point it out and to criticize relentlessly until things begin to change. It's a monolithic view of groups. It doesn't leave room for individual variety or individual agency. And it's like real America, it has this illiberal strain. It's intolerant and rejects some of what I think of as the liberal values that democracy depends on. So I see Real and Just America, even though they're in a tremendous conflict with each other in the culture wars and elsewhere, they have come to mirror each other to some extent. So that's my best shot at a taxonomy of American narratives, and you guys can have your shots at my best shot.
We'll get there, but lay out your vision for an America that deeply resonates with me, Equality America.
Yeah, I call it Equal America, and the phrase popped into my head so last year, I was trapped like a lot of people and couldn't report and couldn't travel. And so I was reading Tocqueville or rereading Tocqueville. And there's just no doubt Tocqueville saw equality, the desire for equality, for social equality, equality of status as the characteristic that made Americans distinct. And it was kind of a relief almost to hear that we have a national trait, because these four narratives and all the ways in which we talk about each other suggest that we're just alien species to one another. That you leave New York City and drive upstate an hour or two, and suddenly you're in a foreign country. Whereas when you think of equality and the passion for it, for the desire to be as good as everyone else, I think that still holds. And it's the source of a lot of conflict when it doesn't have an outlet or it isn't answered in social conditions. I see it as behind a lot of the fights and conflict among the four Americas, which is the inequality is behind a lot of it. And so I'm not totally persuaded by it, but right now, Equal America would be my dream of how we can begin to both improve material conditions and also govern ourselves again, because the two are related. In Tocqueville, self-government, free institutions depend on that sense of shared citizenship that comes from equality. There are countries where a permanent subordinate class could exist and still have social peace, but I don't think that's possible.
It's not America.
So that's why self-government and the skills and habits that it requires depends on that feeling of the possibility of being equal. So those are my two keywords: equality and self-government.
So
sorry to talk so much, but you asked me.
No, this is good.
No, we always talk through the show, and we said specifically, let's allocate 10 to 15 just to get the actual framework out there. Because like you said, this is a polemical argument, so it's important to have that there. So I want to start here. And because we actually have a broad base of listenership across, frankly, all four Americas, we're going to come at your ideas from a bunch of different directions. So these might not necessarily even be things that we believe. We're just audience advocates here. So something that's very interesting is the way I think of the Biden years is I think the most important debates that are happening aren't between left and right. In many ways, they're debates within the Democratic Party, within the center left to progressive direction to the left. Just America, Smart America, and basically those two cohorts there. So something that comes to mind, the second you said equality, on the center left to left, equality is it's an increasingly controversial phrase, because there's a way of me putting on a left-wing hat and saying, don't you mean equity? Because if we're talking about equality, what does equality say about the question of, let's say, reparations? Because equity would suggest we need reparations, when from, I think, Sagar, my perspective, I would say that reparations, especially the inarticulate Tumblr version of reparations, is almost certainly going to lead to a world which doesn't look like that equal America that we're looking like.
Yep.
So what does equal America, in your viewpoint, what does that say about reparations and those very tinged debates where it feels like you are engaging in some form of zero-sum giving and taking in those parts?
That is a great question. And you're absolutely right that between the center left and the left, or you could say smart and just America, there is a tremendous conflict going on right now. It's also a generational conflict. Although I find more and more people half my age who are sympathetic to my critique of Just America. Still, Just America is a young narrative. Equity has replaced equality for a lot of people on the left. In fact, I caught Biden in a speech starting to say equality, and then he corrected himself, because equity is not a word he normally would use. It's a new term. It's only come up in the last few years, really in the 6 or 7 years that Just America has been a dominant narrative. Originally, people said, oh, equity is just giving everyone what they need. That was the new version, not fairness, which is kind of the traditional version of equity, but giving everyone what they need. But equity has hardened into something closer to ensuring that outcomes are the same across identity groups. And that's actually how it's defined in the Biden administration's executive order from the very first week.
Yep.
Equity becomes like a dominant thrust of all domestic policy, and it's described in terms of identity groups. I am very uneasy with that. I think it leads to perverse policies. Like, this was before Biden came into office, but the CDC originally was going to start the vaccine with essential workers because non-whites were overrepresented in that group. Whereas the people most likely to die were the old, where whites are overrepresented. It didn't make sense as a policy. So if you start looking at equal outcomes across identity groups, I think 9 times out of 10, you're going to end up not solving the problem that you're trying to solve.
No argument here. I mean, Jordan Peterson essentially rose to prominence during the Trump years, explicitly arguing about equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. I very much view myself in the latter category. I know that's what you are at least talking about. Peterson's name, Peterson's name notwithstanding. I think one quibble.
Can I
please
just
go ahead. Yeah.
I have two minds about this because having said all of that, I am not sure that the government doesn't owe Black farmers special treatment. They have been systematically discriminated against and dispossessed for decades and decades by the USDA and by state governments and by their white neighbors. And so is it really any idea of fairness to say, okay, now we're going to start treating all farmers the same? And so when Biden put extra money in his COVID relief bill for Black farmers, part of me thought, yeah, that may be reparations, but there's such a direct line of discrimination and unfairness that something has to be done like this. Of course, now it's facing legal challenges and a lot of resentment from white farmers, and that's the downside of any effort at reparations. You're going to create problems.
But this is the thing. That's why I very specifically said the dumb version of the reparations conversation, because I'm glad you brought up the Black farmer example, because I think if we're going to create a taxonomy of reasonable conversations around reparations, that is really a direct one, especially given the fact that the federal government is so intertwined in the agricultural industry ever since the New Deal period. That's just so straightforward. You could have a good faith conversation there. Where I get frustrated, and this has come up in a few of your other podcast appearances, I am frustrated by the inability to have a more broadly honest conversation around these topics, by which I do not think the equity conversation leads us to. So, for example, I think within the equal framework, you can have a fair-minded conversation about Black farmers who still own their land and still have these different bits. But I don't think if you're looking at the distribution of vaccines, I think there were cases in, for example, the city of Oakland where we're experimenting with UBI programs, and you had organizations saying they were going to give it to Black people and not. And once again, this isn't the government, so like try not to own me, listeners. That
was city government, Marshall.
But there was city government, but a nonprofit was funding it, so it's complicated. So once again, we're talking about the idea here. I think equity leads to really dangerous conversations that, once again, aren't even productive. So I think that's just why what I want to just highlight there is that equity doesn't lead, I think, to a reasonable conversations around reparations post 1865. I just saw that Mr. Johnson, he founded BET, the first Black billionaire. He was talking about how he favors like complete reparations for Black people, and that's a conversation. But I think what's so useful about your book and the framework here is how do we think through these problems in a way that's constructive? And I don't think equity leads to a helpful outcome around reparations. But Sagar, please come in.
Yeah, I guess where I start to see this all break down is, look, I care a lot too about some of the legacy of Jim Crow and redlining and all of that, but we also live in a multiracial, heterogeneous democracy. And politically, if you want to accomplish that goal, it just seems to me that, and I've made this case a lot and I've gotten yelled at a lot, if you want equity, you need to speak in the language of equal politics, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of resentment. I've been thinking recently a lot about my own personal identity, just to go left, which is, look, like my parents are Brahmin Indians. So maybe it's just that I see class in a very different way that most Americans are not used to, as in like, it's like baked into the ethos. And I have seen this happen in India. Like whenever you see in India, when class is literally baked into the society, but race isn't, you see how politics can cleave along different lines in very, very different ways. And increasingly in my lifetime, was born in the 1992, it feels like in the last decade, especially the last 15 years, post-Iraq or more, that we've been living more in that reality of like, all I could see is class in a lot of these debates. And it seems to me that, yes, of course, the story of race and class and all that is deeply intertwined. But if I were to want to achieve Black equity for farmers, I would focus specifically on poor farmers across the board, knowing that disproportionately that Black farmers would be represented within that, specifically because I know that would be more politically palatable and easier to accomplish. I'm curious for your view on that from a political angle.
Right. So then we have to put aside Platonic justice and just say, how are you going to succeed? And you're probably right. Biden's equity policies are already generating, it's hard to tell exactly how much discontent, because these things have a way of percolating slowly, and then suddenly we have an election and we find out just how many people were pissed off about something. So I think the Republican Party is counting on critical race theory to get them over the finish line in the midterms. Is the COVID bill and the disproportionate money going to Black farmers, although I think the phrase was disadvantaged in the bill. They can't explicitly identify racial groups, but farmers knew who that meant. Does that make it more likely that there's not going to be a second chance and that there's going to be a backlash? I think it does. But I also think Biden and the people who wish him well, if they want to remedy real injustices that are easily identified, they need to explain it. They can't use the jargon of equity and marginalized and the rest of the vocabulary that the left uses in order to create a kind of credential system where a lot of people feel like they have not passed the course and so they don't get to participate in the conversation. They need to explain, Biden or someone, maybe Kamala Harris, needs to explain it in terms of equality. Harris made a big mistake, I thought, in putting out an ad right before the election in which she essentially said, yeah, equality, that's kind of old-fashioned and it doesn't really solve the problem. Here's equity. And the famous cartoon of the baseball, I think, it was the mountain. It
was a mountain.
Climbing the mountain.
Yeah,
there's several versions. Who is she trying to reach? What is she trying to do? How is she trying to persuade people to vote Democratic with an ad like that? That's the kind of thing that shows how deeply ingrown a lot of the dialogue or monologue on the left has become and how alienating it can be for a lot of people. So I'm actually for money going to Black farmers because of a history of federal government discrimination, but I'm also for recognizing just how explosive that is and for taking a lot of care to show that this is part of a larger program that I would call Equal America, not Equitable America, and that includes everyone who is on the struggling end of the economy, which Biden is doing more with the infrastructure bill, where he's talking about broadband in rural areas of Wisconsin, as well as improved water lines in cities. So to me, the infrastructure bill is a very good example of Equal America in action.
It's funny. I was thinking around, because I actually agree with you. I once again, not an expert on ag policy, but I'm inclined towards reparations, if not for a better word, for Black farmers. But what you're describing is just politics. The government did this thing bad to this group of people. We don't live in a zero-sum society. Therefore, the government is going to compensate those people. That is what you would say. You do not create a weird cartoon that's very clearly from Twitter and Tumblr put together by 28-year-olds who are speaking to a non-existent constituency. So what's so funny is that I agree with Sagar's political diagnosis of the problem, but I'm agreeing with your policy outcome, George. I think it's just coming. I think there's a need. Yeah. So please come in.
Here's another example of equity. So the Biden administration's education department released a regulation guideline. What kinds of grant applications are we going to be looking for? And it was equity. Equity was the key word in the guidelines. What did they mean by it? They meant the 1619 Project and Ibram Kendi, who has used equity as kind of the catch-all remedy for racism. There you have, I think, a philosophically deeply flawed approach and an absolutely perverse outcome, because what you're going to end up with is abolishing standardized tests, dumbing down curricula, creating DEI instruction that really becomes a form of retraining of teachers and maybe even children. And in the end, you are not going to create equal opportunity in education. Everyone is going to get a slightly, or maybe much more than slightly, worse education than they got before. So that's why you can't just generalize and say I'm for or against equity. I think you need to look at what is the issue. And in terms of education, equality, equal opportunity should be what we're always talking about. It's really hard to get to, maybe even impossible, but we should always be trying to approach it, because that's the only way children are going to get the education they deserve.
Absolutely.
Sorry, one quick thing. I want to push you on something then. I tested this out on my girlfriend before the taping and she cringed. So I will speak very delicately here.
I won't cringe, I promise.
On a different podcast appearance, you were discussing CRT and you said specifically that you oppose state bans on CRT. And I think there's plenty of, just from a basic, is this well written? Is this philosophically consistent? Is this even accomplishing the goals you're doing? There are plenty of examples of really poorly written CRT bills. So let's put those aside for a second, right? So let's just imagine you've got a perfectly written bill that very clearly says, and once again, what is CRT? That's a whole debate. But basically, like, we don't believe that Ibram Kendi thought, Robin DiAngelo thought should be taught in our schools. Very precise. But you still were saying you are opposed to any types of bans for a broader philosophical reason. So here's my question. Now I'm putting on my right-wing hat.
Okay.
What do you want people from freedom and normal, real America to do in the face of Biden executive orders, Robin DiAngelo, and the 1619 Project? Because once again, these are all, at best, center-left projects. At best, right? I'm being very generous when I say center left. So if you're a person on the right, if you're someone who lives in, and I'm not going to pick Mississippi because there's obviously a variety of reasons why you'd be uncomfortable with that. Let's say you're a person from Idaho or Arizona and you're on the right and you pass this law because you say, I don't like Robin DiAngelo. What else are you supposed to do? The right doesn't have access to the academy. The right can't put together a Watchmen episode on HBO where the whole episode centers, justifiably, right, on the Tulsa race massacre, which I completely support teaching. It seems like the reason why the right is doing ham-fisted bans of these types of policies is if you're looking at a peer zooming out, what does the power structure of America look like? Just America and smart America have complete control over the dialogue of these things. So if you're saying that right America, for very legitimate and good faith philosophical reasons, shouldn't support blanket bans, what should they do if they think this ideology is destructive?
Well, what you're getting at is something that, I wrote about Andrew Breitbart in The Unwinding. He was my representative journalist of the era. And I don't think I was totally off on that. And Breitbart got his start when he recognized that the culture belonged to the left. And it turned out that the culture is at least as important as political power. So he entered internet commentary and everything he became in order to seize the culture back from the left. So I guess one thing I would say is just have a better cultural offering. Stop being simply a negative reactionary force that says we will refuse to enter the modern world where a lot of young people feel like their identity is being denied by the right wing. Instead, listen and maybe even loosen the rigidities and create a better culture that is more appealing to young people and to the future of America, rather than thinking that the 50s is the only way we can represent ourselves. But
I hate to do it, George, but it's like there's a lot of right-wing people out there. And I grew up in College Station, Texas, and I know what they're going to say. They're like, oh, so you want me to enter the 21st century by teaching my white child that they have innate, hatred in them because they're white? You want me to tell my child that they don't have a gender, that they're assigned birth, and that they can play with whatever toys they want, and we're going to play around with like different dolls or whatever, and we're not going to use terms. I mean, it gets very charged very quickly.
Right. Well,
and this is where I think it's important to represent them.
Well, I would say to that person, now you're totally distorting what I just said, because you should teach your child what you think you need to, and teaching white guilt to 4-year-olds is a disaster. Teaching it to 14-year-olds is a disaster. I think teaching it to 40-year-olds is a disaster. So no, I think Robin DiAngelo is a huckster who has made an extremely good living on a kind of a kind of magic thinking that white people want to listen to because they're desperate to set down the load of shame and guilt that they feel, and in some cases feel legitimately. It doesn't work. Instead, it just creates a false sense of virtue and a lot of resentment among people like that guy you were just imagining. Mm-hmm. So I would say, no, don't accede to it, but fight it without having to ban it. If you start banning things, I think in this country, you will lose. In the end, the idea of an open, free society of expression is always going to be a more attractive one for Americans. There may be a temporary gain in a state legislature forcing some high school teacher to stop saying stupid things in class. But in the end, I think it's probably going to maybe even reinforce the appeal of those stupid things, because we don't like to be told what we can and can't think and can and can't say. And I think it would be a better approach for people on the right to do what I think people on the left have to do when they're confronted with really stupid ideas on the right, which is not cancel them, but show that they're stupid by being persuasive, by being better. It's hard. It's not nearly satisfying in the short term as simply saying, we have banned you. You can't say that anymore. But I think that's a dead end in America. And it's also kind of at odds with my idea of what a good democratic society is about.
I think that's fair. I do want to say, I do think this is one thing where I was curious in your formulation of why you think smart and just America are different. Because it seems to me that just America is smart America. I mean, the larger, the meritocratic rise, where is critical race theory and the defense of it most popular? It's amongst Ivy League graduates. It's amongst people in the highest echelons of American income. If you were to look at even amongst quote unquote free America, I mean, Jamie Dimon and Jeff Bezos and all these people are pretty aligned rhetorically with just America. It seems to me that just America essentially rules all of American culture, and that even within smart America, you're required to like recite the shibboleths of just America in order to simply exist within a smart America environment. So I'm just wondering, like, why is the distinction there? I just don't know if they're opposed. I really do think they're almost one and the same. Go ahead, Mark.
Just to add on to this.
Yeah.
What Sagar and I are basically saying here is I don't see where the rebellion is coming in. So you said that just America is rebelling against this, but to Sagar's point, it seems like other than wanting to move up the ladder a little quicker, every single thing that just America is saying is compatible with what smart America was doing before.
Actually, that's the only thing that you've just said that I disagree with. First of all, these narratives, as I say in Last Best Hope, they are fluid. They morph into each other. They influence each other. They're not siloed off into four completely monolithic categories. In fact, they all come from a single society. And so just by definition, they're related to each other and affect each other. So just America comes out of smart America and has taken on a lot of the same anxieties and a lot of the same habits, but it's changed the terms of accreditation so that now it's no longer simply, what school do you go to, but do you know what BIPOC means? It's the term, the new terminology is a new test of admission into the elect. The old terminology may have been something more technical or professional. So in a sense, Just America has taken on the habit of finding, fault in small degrees with things that don't measure up, but it's changed the landscape. It's changed the area in which it's finding fault. I think of Just America as, and by the way, the one thing I disagree with is that everything is the same. Meritocracy does not mean what it used to mean. It's now a dirty word. If you talk about meritocracy at an Ivy League school, you're going to get a lot of students telling you that they don't believe in it, that they don't think that their place there reflects genuine merit, that they're there because of their race or because of their family or because of their income. So in a way, the basic innocent view of meritocracy, which is that we really all can get as far as our talents and efforts will take us, is no longer has any hold over a lot of young progressive Americans. They reject that. But they have the same habits and they also want the same advantages. It's not as though they're going to give up all the advantages that come from the meritocracy. It's just that they want them on different terms that have more to do with moral clarity than with professional success. And on the flip side, Smart America has essentially abdicated. It's not as though Smart America is identical to Just America. Smart America generationally has said, you are stronger than we are. We are afraid of you. We're afraid of losing our positions and of our institutions being either overrun or destroyed. So we are going to abdicate. And in some ways, a lot of people can convince themselves that it's not an abdication, that they really believe it. But I see from personal experience how much of this is essentially a kind of surrender of terms by an older generation that, like all older people, feels it's becoming irrelevant and wants to remain relevant by learning how to talk in a new way. That's a bit dismissive, and I know there are a lot of people who've undergone genuine transformations in the last few years, but I also know there's a lot of opportunism and a lot of fear in the culture. You can't underestimate it.
So something I want to know, I would like you to reflect, and you've done this in other episodes and in the book, on what the narrative, and you also discussed it at the top of the podcast, what the narrative violations basically running through last summer and BLM's positivity collapsing after the initial moment right after George Floyd's murder, where you had Sean Hannity doing a pro-George. There's this weird quick moment. And then the summer started.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah, there was this brief week-long moment where you did see something transformational start to happen. You have the Biden election, you have his numbers of white men going down, but his numbers of like Hispanic and black males, like once again, not going crazy up, but still going up. What does that all mean? Because a quick anecdote I just want to tell for you, and I think this speaks to the problems of Just America, is I was talking to this person, and it was right after Derek Chauvin was sentenced, and he said, I was talking with my friends in law school, and it's really tough for us because he murdered George Floyd, so I want him punished. But at the same time, we're all prison abolitionists. So I don't know how to reconcile these two things. And I think if we were to sum up why Just America is a dead end in terms of solving the political problems of the country, I really think it was that specific anecdote, in the sense that the jargon, prison abolitionist, I think he assumed that because I'm black, I was like gonna be down for that, which I'm just like not. So he was assuming he was a
habit in Just America. Yeah.
Yeah, he assumed that because I'm black, I was gonna, be a prison abolitionist. And which, by the way, there's a lot of interesting scholarship on how actually Black America is actually very, very crime and punishment in the right context, which is a whole other episode we could do sometime. But the whole point is I'm so frustrated by this. And I wonder if these gut check moments, whether they're going to lead towards the fifth way that we're kind of hoping and pining for. And I'm just curious, as you're talking to people, I mean, you're saying things on this podcast that just were verboten last year. I don't think it's quite, there's way more Twitter's Twitter, but like there's way more blue check Twitter dunking on Robin DiAngelo right now than there was 9 months ago, in a way that people would not do. Yeah. So just what's happening? Can you just help us understand that?
Well, I was one of the authors of the Harpers Letter last summer, and that was a revelation.
Could you explain the Harpers Letter?
Yeah,
itself?
This is so far in the online discourse. It may not.
I know. Yeah. I'm sorry. Do we need to explain it? Maybe I should leave that out.
Yeah, please.
All I want to say,
no, it's important.
The level of intolerance and outrage was so high that you could not get 150 respected writers of all identity groups to say we need freedom of expression in order to get justice and expect to have much sympathy from a lot of the culture. It was an outrage what we did to publish a letter saying that. Things have changed. That was the heat of the protests. And I think people are exhausted, and people don't like to be told over and over again what they can and can't say and what they can and can't think. And I'm telling you, there is a new generation coming up, maybe my children's generation, that's going to say, our parents told us, they gave me a book called Anti-Racist Baby or something like that. What the hell were they thinking? And they may go in a direction that their parents will find extremely disquieting, because young people just don't like to be told what to think. And that has had a positive effect in the sense that the incidents have become so extreme. And so obviously not just intolerant, because that's like a philosophical value, but heading toward nothing but bad things, not solving problems, not like the idea of banning standardized tests. Most normal people immediately know that's not going to create better education outcomes. And in fact, I think a poll showed that Black and brown people in New York, when given the choice of either banning standardized tests or improving and giving out free test prep to all New York high school students, went for the latter, not the former. That's equal opportunity. That's not equity. And I think maybe even the election of Biden, which was so obviously equal America, not just America, pushing him over the line and getting him the nomination in the first place. Maybe there's a bit of a sobering up politically, simply in practical terms, on the left, of people who might think we went a little too far, our language alienated people. We at least have to start thinking about how most people in this country think, rather than how we think they ought to think.
Well, I'm not sure though, because look at New York City.
I hear Latinx a lot. That's quick thing. No. I hear it less than I was before.
Yeah, but I still hear defund the police in the New York City primary. And Maya Wiley still lost the New York City primary, and AOC explicitly endorsed her because of defund the police. I still see it in the largest city in the United States.
Well,
right?
AOC, her brand, this is part of the problem. She has a brand, and her brand is to defund the police. And so she's going to support the candidate who's talking that way. And that candidate is currently in third place with, a rather small fraction of the vote compared to the first two who were against it. So will AOC ever say, if I want to get anywhere in American politics, I need to think about how most people in New York think? I doubt it, because the incentives in our politics today are not to create coalitions. They are to build your brand and hold on to your hardcore, which she does. She's become a huge success by doing that.
Absolutely. Biggest fundraiser in Congress. I tell people that all the time. I'm like, look, Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC, part of the same, two sides of the same coin. You can make a whole lot of money. You can be a party star. Doesn't mean it's necessarily good for the country. I am curious though. I heard you.
I'm just going to interject. MGT is far worse for the country than like AOC is. So I'm just going to,
you could say
I understand the point you're making, but I'm just going to make that
they are only equal structurally. They are not equal in substance. Yeah.
You guys could say it. All right. So whatever I think though about how to solve all of this, I do not look at anybody in our current politics who has not been ideologically captured in one way or the other, which is capable of addressing this. I think Biden is literally so old that he was inoculated to it. He was so old, he actually remembered Stokely Carmichael, same with Jim Clyburn, who was like, wait a second, this was a disaster in the 1960s, and it led to the 1968 election of Richard Nixon. Everybody else is young enough that they don't even know who the hell I'm talking about. They probably don't even know who Stokely Carmichael is. So I think Biden is like the last bastion. And yet, I heard you on I think it was with Anne-Marie Slaughter, and you were asked about like politicians who get it. And, I'm really going to be frank. Like, I was shocked because you mentioned Stacey Abrams and Elizabeth Warren. And I was like, these are two, and look, I get it. Like, everybody on the right, people like me, we were all loving the Elizabeth Warren of the book who wrote the book Two Income Trap and the economic protectionism. We were like, hell yeah, awesome. But like, she was the girl boss identity politics candidate. Like, had the Black Lives Matter thing in the background of her video at the DNC. She promised the 11-year-old trans kid they could, approve the Department of Education secretary. She was going to wear a pussy hat at her inauguration. I mean, it just seems clearly, ideologically, purely cultural, at least in the way that she represented herself.
Yeah, I agree.
Post 2020.
And I think that's one reason why she lost.
Well, that's why she lost. But same with Stacey Abrams, right? I mean, just hardcore.
Yeah, I would say the Elizabeth Warren I was thinking of was the one in the Unwinding, who was like the populist anti-monopoly, the heir to Robert La Follette. And so, it's a good point. I was maybe wishfully thinking in that moment with Anne-Marie Slaughter, or maybe didn't have time to qualify it.
No, fair. I'm curious then, like, do you see anyone? I don't. I think everybody is so totally captured. I think Biden, like I said, sure, but he's so old. I mean, we just saw today his own aides leaking to Axios. They don't think Kamala could beat Trump. And by the way, I think that's 100% true based upon her horrific political instincts.
Boy, that's sobering.
You just threw a real bomb in the last
sentence there. See, once we let Sagar take over this conversation, sink to the bottom of the ocean. So I would say there are politicians out there, but they're either obscure or they will never get far enough to matter. Michael Bennet of Colorado is a guy I really respect. He's got a lot of good policy ideas. He was behind the child tax credit. And he's also capable of winning over farmers and ranchers in Western Colorado. So Sherrod Brown, who mainly talks about labor and workers in Ohio, I think they're both sort of throwbacks to an earlier type of Democrat, which Biden is also. Biden, I mean, you said Stokely Carmichael. I think he remembers the FDR of his infancy.
That's true.
You're underestimating the age.
He's that old.
4 years old when FDR died. I think he's a Roosevelt Democrat. And that has been the weird fluke of history that has, I think, given us a glimmer of hope that we're now being led by someone who doesn't come out of any of the four narratives in my book. He precedes them. But when I look at who's left after him, I can't say you're wrong. I don't see a lot of figures who are willing to tell their own side what they don't want to hear, to put it simply.
Mm-hmm. And I'll close because we went down a dark mixing metaphor rabbit hole, ocean depths. We're gonna pull out of that for a quick second, because here's what I want to ask you about. As we said halfway through the episode, the smart thing that Peter Thiel predicted in 2012 was that there is this opening for telling the darker version of the story in a way that was counterintuitive. And the reason why we're having the conversation around political homelessness, and the reason why we're having the conversation around equal America, is I am just more and more convinced that there is this 4, 8, 10-year period of mediocrity and darkness and failure in American politics. But one of the advantages of our democratic system is you will have political entrepreneurs who see, hey, wait a second, people don't like getting labeled. Hey, wait a second, I don't like how nothing works. I see that these other four Americas aren't working, and therefore there's going to be an incentive for politicians we've never heard of who will come up and articulate this the right way. So, I'm just curious, how do you think that goes as someone who studies politicians and someone who studies these narratives, these movements? Because that's my optimistic thing. I think I tell people terrible 5 to 10 years, but a lot of optimism about the 2030s. How do you think about it?
I really hesitate to predict. I feel like my trade is not soothsaying, but observing.
So let me put it a better way. Not predict, right? Because everyone hates predictions. How do you see this? Okay, let me better contextualize this. So in the moment where this crystallized for me, the political homeless thing, Sagar and I were in Austin, and the clerk at my hotel and someone on the airplane recognized me from this podcast. Not from Breaking Points, not from Rising, but from the podcast. And they both explicitly said, we are left, but we like how you guys have honest conversations. I'm not saying this to brag. I'm saying this in the sense of that was a real moment of, wait, this is organic and this is real. And as someone who studies the DC space, you know, very few things are organic and are real. So my point is that I just look at that as, let's say, a politician, not as a podcaster, and say, holy crap, those two people saying that feels to me like an opportunity in the way that Peter Thiel is seeing an opportunity back in 2012. So let me just ask you to reflect then upon the audience that I am seeing right now. It could go a bunch of different ways, but just reflect on that.
I mean, I wrote Last Best Hope.
You monetized,
on the bet that there is a hunger to be free, to be unshackled from cliches and false dichotomies and ideas that defy basic human decency as well as common sense. Yeah, I think I have not lost, let's just say I have not lost my faith in ordinary Americans. They do try it. I mean, let's be honest, the insurrection in the Capitol included a lot of people who you would meet at the local bar or at a truck stop and think this is a decent, good guy who I could sit down and have a really interesting conversation with. So there are tendencies and strains that are really moving in a different direction from the one you were talking about, Marshall. But of course, I'm hopeful. And of course, I'm working, as you guys are, to try to push us in a direction where we can have both a more honest conversation and just a more human politics that allows for people to disagree, to argue without having to condemn the other as an evil, adversary, and where we can see that there actually are some things that a lot of people would be able to get behind. And that wouldn't immediately be fodder for Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity. And even if they are, maybe it won't matter because Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity won't have the currency that we've given them over the last decade or two.
Now you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
So now you're really speaking my language, George.
I'm with you guys on this. You and I obviously are of pretty different political tendencies, but the way you're doing it is more important than what you're saying. And that is something I really appreciate. And I see more and more of it. I think there's all these little institutions, Substacks, tiny groups, little magazines coming out that are obviously geared toward finding those politically homeless people. And those people are out there and want to be found. So keep doing what you're doing.
Really appreciate it, George. There are literally millions more than the audience for cable news. It's just that they've been ignored for a long time. So everybody, can you hold the book up again? I want everybody to go out there, buy the book, Last Best Hope, America, Crisis, and Renewal. Will be available in our bookshop. Buy it wherever you can. Support George. Is there anywhere else you want to find? Tell people to go?
One quick thing, George, could you shout out your other books? Because
they're all very good.
Yeah.
I've written 5 books about America now in 20 years. The first was called Blood of the Liberals. It was a 3-generational family story. The Assassin's Gate, about the war in Iraq, which I covered for the New Yorker. The Unwinding, about Americans in forgotten places, detached from power, from media, from politics. Our Man, a biography of Richard Holbrooke and kind of an account of America from during what's called the American century, really, the heyday of our power and then the waning of it with the post 9/11 wars. Last Best Hope is my summation. And now I should write about, I don't know, like animals, the things that interest my son. I should write about the octopus. That's going to be what my next book is about, because I've said enough.
I love it. I think I've got Our Man right behind me. So really appreciate you joining us, George. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it, guys. Hope to do it again.
Oh, anytime.
Good luck to you both.